So we're going to focus on nervous system today. So your nervous system's basic job, its function, is to interact with your body systems to help coordinate your responses, your behaviors. It's going to receive that sensory information and it's going to process and integrate that information, and then it's going to coordinate the response. And that information may come from an outside source or it may come from an internal source. We need to keep in mind that our nervous system is monitoring what's happening both inside and outside of our environment. The example that we have here in this picture, this would be a Pavlov dog kind of example. Okay, so the nervous system here, the response is that when it sees food or smells food, okay, there's a stimulus, it's going to salivate. And so the nervous system is what's going to coordinate that response. It's going to receive the stimulus through the olfactory receptors in the nose, visual receptors in the eye, okay, and then it's going to coordinate the response of salivation. Okay, and so the rest of this example talks about conditioning, okay, that the dog then begins to associate the tuning fork sound with food, and after a long period of time, okay, after that continued stimulus, it can receive just the tuning fork stimulus and it will have that same coordinated response. Okay, but really what we need to understand is that the nervous system is what is controlling and making that response happen. It processed and received the information and then it made the response. So we're going to focus mostly on nervous system of humans, okay, but we do need to realize that lots and lots of different animals and organisms all have a nervous system. So if you take a look at this, let's look at some of the kind of the evolutionary links that are happening here. And hopefully you'll realize that as we increase, okay, we're seeing more and more complexity, okay, as we go kind of up the evolutionary chain here. Okay, we get more and more complexity here. We also get an increase, so it gets more complex, an increase in sensory reception. So the kind of sensory receptors we have, their ability to receive information, okay, things like eyes begin to develop. Okay, so there's an increase in sensory perception, okay, as well as an increase in what's called cephalization. And all cephalization is that there is a, that's an O. All cephalization is that you're getting a concentration of nervous tissue in the anterior portion of the organism. So you can see here we're starting to get a concentration of the nervous tissue as we start moving up through the evolutionary ladder. So that's our increase in cephalization, our increased concentration of nervous tissue in the anterior or the front region of the organisms. For example, in humans, we have a very large amount of cephalization with the formation of the brain. So let's take a look at the human nervous system. As you can see here, the human nervous system, like I said, has a large amount of cephalization happening. There's a large concentration of nervous tissue in the, if we walked on all fours, it would be the anterior region of the brain, really more towards the head. Okay? But it would be, if we walked on all fours, it would be the anterior region of the organism. So humans' nervous system is divided into a central nervous system and a peripheral nervous system. Hopefully y'all remember central nervous system is only brain and spinal cord, nothing else. These cranial nerves, spinal nerves, they're all part of peripheral nervous system. Okay, so humans, as we went furthest up on the evolutionary ladder, you'll notice their nervous system was significantly more complex. We've got a wide variety of sensory receptors that can receive stimuli. For example, our eyes have specialized receptors to receive stimuli. We've got the olfactory, or our receptors for smell. Okay, we've got gustatory or taste receptors, as well as hearing. And we have a wide variety of receptors in our skin that help us monitor things like pain, temperature, pressure, vibration, all things that combined tell us about touch. Okay, and then we have a large number of receptors inside of our body as well. It is important that we monitor external stimuli, but it is also extremely important that we monitor internal stimuli. Y'all were just working with your example with insulin and glucagon monitoring blood sugars. Well, you've got receptors in your body that are receiving the information about the blood sugar level in your body. Your nervous system processes that information and then sends out the signal to the pancreas to either release the insulin or release the glucagon. Okay, so let's look at some of our basic kind of functions of the nervous system, how it's going to process this information and deal with the response that it's going to make. So first of all, we've got to have our sensory receptor. Okay, so our sensory receptor, like I said, could be inside or outside of the body. It doesn't matter. But this is what's going to receive the stimuli or the stimulus. Okay, and like I said, for the example here, we've got a visual stimulus. It could be a stimulus inside of the body, but that's all the receptor's job is to receive the stimuli. And then that stimuli information, that stimulus information, has to then travel to what's called the integration center. And so it's going to travel along what are called afferent neurons. And afferent neurons are just sensory neurons that are taking that information, like I said, to the integration center or the processing center. And the integration center is in the central nervous system. It's going to be either brain or spinal cord. More often than not, it's the brain. But in certain reflexes where we need something to happen very quickly, very rapidly, it could be the spinal cord. So the integration is the information processing area. This is where a decision is made. It's received all the stimuli, it processes all that information, and then makes the decision as to now what needs to be done about it. And once the decision is made about what needs to be done about it, that information is going to travel along what's called an efferent neuron. And efferent neurons are motor neurons. Okay, so efferent neurons are motor neurons, afferent are sensory neurons. And so that information will head out to what's called the effector. And the effector is what's going to carry out the response. And this is usually a gland or a muscle. Now, that's not a guarantee. That's what it always is. But it's very commonly a gland or a muscle. So the effector, like I said, is what's carrying out, actually doing the response that the nervous system has decided needs to happen. Okay, so let's look at this in terms of a reflex. Let's apply this to a reflex. Okay, so reflexes are going to be very quick, very fast, rapid, automatic responses that you cannot control. They are done to help protect you. And so like I said, with these, the integration center is not always in the brain. It can sometimes be in the central nervous system. But it has the same basic premise of our efferent, afferent nerves, the integration part. So let's take a look at what we have going on here. So first of all, I've got my stimulus. Okay, so that's going to be this pin that is sticking into my skin. So A here would be my receptor. So I've got my receptors in my skin that are receiving the stimulus. And so now they're going to send that information along my afferent neuron. I gotta remember, can't write in cursive. So they'll send that information along my afferent neuron, which would be B then, okay, to the integration center, which in this case is going to be in the central nervous system. So it's in this case going to be in the spinal cord. It's always in the central nervous system. So at my integration center, my decision was made that this hurts and I need to do something about it. So I'm going to send that decision along my efferent neuron. And I'm going to send it to my effector. Okay? And remember, my effector is usually a muscle or a gland. And so in this case, it's a muscle that's going to actually carry out the response of me pulling my hand away from this painful stimulus. Okay? And so it's going to carry out the response that the nervous system has deemed is appropriate. So a neuron is a specialized cell. That's what's going to allow these to happen. It's going to allow that information to travel, to be processed, and then for the information to travel out to the effector again. So neurons have to be able to do detection. Okay? They have to be able to receive that stimulus. So, for example, you have specialized neurons in your eye that receive the stimulus. So they have to be able to do detection. They have to be able to generate and transmit the action potential, the message. Okay, so they have to be conductive. So they have to have conductivity. Okay, remember, neurons are going to transmit messages electrically. So they need to have the ability to conduct that electrical impulse. So they need to be able to do the detection, the generation, the transmission of the impulse, as well as the integration part. They have to be able to integrate that information and make the decisions. So these neurons are going to need some specialized features or specialized abilities to be able to do this job well. So let's look at the different parts of a neuron. So first of all, we've got a dendrite. Okay, and so dendrites are going to be the processes that stick off the neuron that receive information. So a dendrite and an axon both stick off of a neuron. Okay, here's the dendrites of this second neuron down here. Okay, but the dendrite is going to receive information where the axon is going to conduct the action potential away from the neuron cell body. So the dendrite brings information into the neuron cell body, and the axon conducts the action potential away from the cell body. Neurons will have a cell body that will contain most of the cell organelles, ribosomes, mitochondria, nucleus, all the things, typical things a cell would need. And then it has what's called an axon hillock, which is going to be this kind of triangular shape area here, right at kind of the base of the axon. That's where the action potential is going to start from. That's where the integration of all the material that came into all of those dendrites are, and then it's going to generate the action potential or initiate it there at the axon hillock. Okay? And then down at the very end of the neuron, you'll see these axon terminals. And the axon terminals are what synapses are come in contact with our target cell. And our target cell could be another neuron, it could be a muscle cell, it could be a gland. That doesn't matter. You're still going to have those axon terminals where they can synapse with the target cell. So what I would like you to do right now is to pause your video for just a second and just do a quick Venn diagram or chart that helps compare and contrast a neuron cell with a typical animal cell. Because they'll have some things that are the same, but they have some things that are significantly different that allow the neuron to do its job of conductivity, integration, detection. Okay, so pause for a second. Do your quick Venn diagram or chart that compares and contrasts a neuron cell to a typical animal cell, and then pick it back up again. Okay, so now we're going to get into what you guys were doing with your introductory activity that you were doing in class. So we're going to look at how the message actually is able to travel down the neuron. How is that action potential formed, and then how is it propagated or conducted the length of the axon so it can get to the end and be passed on to the next cell. Okay, so it is important that we realize at rest that the neuron is going to have a charge. It has a natural electrochemical gradient. So if we look up here, I had this picture up here in the top left. You can see you've got your sodium is the circle and the potassiums are the diamonds. And so we've got open sodium and potassium channels right now. But you'll notice, okay, hopefully you remember, sodium and potassium ions both have a positive charge. But if you look here, okay, I've got a positive charge on the outside of my cell, but a negative charge on the inside of the cell. Okay, which hopefully logically you would think it would not be that way, okay, because I've got positives on both sides of my membrane. Okay, but if we look over here at this chart here, you'll see I've got a large number of potassiums inside of the cell, large number of sodiums outside of the cell. Okay, and so those kind of balance one another out. Okay, and I've got some chloride, some negative ions on the outside there, okay, that are kind of bringing down my positive charge there. But on the inside, I've got very large proteins on the inside. Very large negatively charged proteins there on the inside. So these very large negatively charged proteins are going to make the inside of the cell have a more negative charge than the outside. Okay, and that's important. And what that means is that this at rest, the membrane of a neuron is what's called polarized. Okay? And we've talked about polarity before, and we've talked about water molecules and how they have a charge and they're polar. Okay? So let's kind of simplify exactly what it means to be polar. Okay? All it means is that there is a separation of charge. Okay? That's all it means if something is polarized or polar, is I've got a separation of charge. And that's exactly what I have on either side of the membrane. Okay, I've got a positive on one side and a negative on the other side of the membrane. So they are separated. And they are separated with a difference of approximately negative